This evening's event is a bit unusual in that it's co-hosted by three organisations. So Roads of Transportation Society Engineers Ireland, Chartered Institute of Highways and Transportation, and the Transport Planning Society as well. So tonight's speaker is Professor Nick Tyler from the University College London Centre for Transport Studies. Excuse me. His presentation this evening pertains to neurodiversity and accessibility challenges in public transport. Nick.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's really lovely to be here. It's a long time since I was last in Dublin, so it's always great to come back, see a bit of civilization. It's always good. So, as Glenn said, thank you very much, Glenn. As Glenn said, I'm going to talk a bit about accessibility, but the way I see accessibility is very much from the perspective, if you like, of neurodiversity, but in the sense that, and I'll go through this a little bit during the course of this evening, because in the end, we are managed by our brain, and how our brain perceives and reacts to the environment is very much about how accessible that environment is. And so how we understand how the brain makes those reactions and interactions becomes actually really important, whatever our particular set of capabilities enables us to do. So whether we find that we are challenged in terms of our locomotion or our hearing or our cognitive capabilities, actually at the end of the day, we have a brain which is enabling us to function and to survive. And that is actually what we're making accessible. So I'll explain this as I sort of go along. And the first sort of question is, we talk about accessibility, but I sometimes wonder what we really mean by it. And over history, we've meant accessibility in many different ways. Many years ago, it was basically accessibility, and some people still talk about it in this way, is about I can get from A to B. And a lot of transport modeling is about exactly that. You know, how do we get, and can I get from A to B? This place is very accessible because I can get from A to B. But if I cannot get on a bus and I cannot go, therefore, from A to B, is the place accessible? And so actually accessibility has a kind of condition attached to it that I need to be able to board, for example, a bus. And does accessibility mean that I should be able, or I can board a bus irrespective of any differences I have in capabilities? You know, so if I need to have a wheelchair in order to be able to maneuver around a city, and the bus is incapable of accepting that wheelchair, is it accessible? So those sorts of questions come in about that. And what about if we go a little bit further up in the hierarchy? Does accessibility mean that I can do the things that I really want to do? So if I can't get into the football stadium, can I watch the football? Can I, and actually, is my life's ambition to get on a bus? Or is my life's ambition to do something else for which I need to get on a bus? And it's this latest thing. It's about why this accessibility phenomenon has become so complicated for us is because we get a kind of muddle between all of this, from the kind of transport modeler who just thinks accessibility is about A to B, and if I can get from A to B, I've ticked the accessibility box, right down to the person who says, well, actually, we need to be able to get everybody able to do whatever they wish to do in the city. And until that is the case, life as we seek to enjoy it is not possible. So we have a kind of ghost in the room about what we mean by accessibility. And I think it's really worth us in the transport world pausing to think about that, because if we don't understand what we mean by accessibility, how are we actually going to deliver it? And if different people in the sector have different views as to what accessibility is, how do we know that the message is actually going where it should go? So why do we actually have this this ghost in the room, as it were? Well, I think, to me, it's around the way we think about accessibility, and I think that there are three important things about accessibility, but they actually all include one word. And I think when we talk about, or when I talk about accessibility, I think it means that we need to be thinking about other perspectives, other ways of looking at the world, allocentrism, the way that other people see the world, people who have different sets of capabilities than I have. It means thinking about other people, not just what I can do, what I find easy or what I find difficult. And it means thinking about other needs, things that I don't think maybe are terribly important or whatever, but somebody else does. So I think the first piece of education I like to give my students, instead of thinking about themselves, they actually need to think about these other issues, the other. And that sense of thinking about the other is one of the ways of opening the door to thinking about accessibility. If you think of accessibility only in your own terms, it will not be accessible for everybody else. And so we've hit a bit of a buffer, and certainly in the UK, because for the last 30 plus years, or 30, 40 years perhaps, we have kind of lived in a world in the UK, and I don't know about Ireland, but in the UK, I think this is true, where the trend has been to individualize. Margaret Thatcher very famously said, there is no such thing as society, you only have individuals. And that is one of those attractive populist kind of things to say, but actually it carries a rather poor message that somehow or other individuals are what matters and not society as a whole. And I argue a lot around the fact that Homo sapiens as a species survived the last climate catastrophe several thousand years ago on the basis that it was a social species. It's a species which genetically was different from the other hominins because it carried with it the capability of communication, of collaboration, of cooperation, and that became necessary as food supply changed following the climate catastrophe, and you no longer could walk around and just find food everywhere. You suddenly had to go and work with other people to catch a big animal or to find food. And Homo sapiens survived because it could do that. It's hardwired into our genes. We are here today because an ancestor of ours, or of each of us, got the right call when they were doing that. And that it is part of our genetic makeup. So sociality becomes really, really important. So if we're living in a society that is tending to individualize, that's kind of going against the way that Homo sapiens has evolved, and therefore becomes a source of stress and difficulty for people, for society. And that sense of sociality, the ability to communicate, we did some work in Birmingham a few years ago when we asked them what made them feel better, what gave them a better sense of well-being in the city, and not the top answer, but the second answer, which is much more interesting. The top one, which is what you expect to see. The second answer was walking down the street, seeing somebody I don't know, and being able to say hello to them. And that was it. It wasn't have a conversation. It was simply being able to greet a person they didn't know without the feeling that that could be a dangerous thing to do, that it was a threat or in any other way. That was one of their very, very high level markers of well-being in the city. That sociality, that kind of marker of being able to greet. And that hardwiring is really important when we come to talk about accessibility, because accessibility isn't an amorphous cloud of smoke, as we saw earlier. Accessibility is about how people do things together. And that, I think, is why accessibility is such a highly important thing for us in society, because it is there to enable us to survive. it's not about being nice or just being able to go to the pub. It's actually about survival. And I think we need to go into that very basic world of what it is to be survivable, to survive. And one of the interesting models that I have around that comes from a book about neurodiversity. Why neurodiversity gives us a model is interesting. So the first thing is that we think of it as a cloud. It's not a thing, it's not an object, it's a cloud, so it's floating, it's a little bit amorphous. And the first characteristic of this cloud is that we're in an ecosystem. It's not a machine. We are actually all in it together, that everything in the world actually works together and works as a system. It's a system which is ecological, so it consists of everything and everything working together. And when everything works together, it works. If something isn't able to work together, it doesn't work. Accessibility is one of those things which enables things to work together. So we can make that ecosystem the living organism kind of idea, rather than a machine which only does what it is set out to do, what it's designed to do, and only does it when you switch it on and tell it to do it, if you're lucky. The second angle here is around capabilities. I tend to talk about capabilities rather than disabilities, because I think, partly because I think it's more positive, and partly because I think it opens up the language of how we manage to do things, even if the way that everybody else does it is different. So it's how do we actually manage to do things that we find very difficult? I have no 3D vision, for example. How do I manage to survive in a 3D world when I cannot see in 3 dimensions? And I find ways of doing it. I didn't even realize I didn't have 3D vision until about 5 years ago. And so it never made any difference to me. But capabilities are really important. And what they actually add up to isn't that there's a binary thing that you can do one thing or not. It's about a continuum. And that continuum is about how able you are. So many people who would be described conventionally as disabled people, actually the continuum of disability is actually huge, from very nearly, in some cases, very excellent at things, right the way through to being completely unable for one reason or another to do something. And that continuum of competence, of being able to do something, is actually really important to see it in that way. The third one is to take those competences, and what we think of competences aren't some sort of machined tool that says I can do X or I can do Y. Those competences are defined by culture. In some cultures, it's necessary to do certain things. It would be very difficult to live in Switzerland if you couldn't speak 3 languages. If you want to live in a culture where color is very important, if you don't have color vision, you will find a greater problem. If you live in a country where hearing is very important and you don't have hearing, that becomes important. In another culture where hearing is unimportant, then the fact that you don't have hearing wouldn't matter so much. So whether something is a competence that you need depends on the culture. And it also depends on time and place. It changes. People can do things in different times, and they can do things in different places or not. And so that sense that the ability to do something, for example, at night under low light conditions, might be very different for somebody compared with doing it during the day under bright light conditions. And so you can't just have a box that says can do, can't do. It's very, very flexible and moving. And I think we need to understand that when we're talking about the capabilities thing, we're not necessarily talking about being able to hear, for example. We're talking about how I manage to work in a world where people are communicating by voice when I cannot hear that voice. How do I manage? Like, how do I manage without 3D vision? It's a much more trivial example, but the sense of when that becomes important and when it is not important is actually crucial. And how do I cope? How do I manage my capabilities rather than my disabilities is actually, I think, a really important question for us, especially when we're trying to design something. The next one is around capabilities, meaning adapting the brain to the environment. When I saw this in the neurodiversity book, I kind of wondered about this. So why am I trying to adapt my brain to the environment? And then I realized, of course, that's what we do. Your brain receives information from the environment. It then actually puts that together and says, in order for you to survive in this environment, you need to do X. And so, or the brain needs to do certain thing. If you are in a crowded train, for example, we have some work going on about this. You're in a crowded train, you will release a quantity of cortisol into your bloodstream. Why? Because the proximity of other people in that crowded train is perceived by the brain to be a threat. And the answer to being in a threatening situation is the brain says, I need to put energy into the system. Maybe I need to put energy in the system to run away very fast. Maybe I need to put energy into the system in order for me to do the cognitive things that I need to do to tell me that although this is a terribly threatening situation, it is okay, but I have to convince myself of that. That's cognitive work. So we measure how much extra cognitive work is done by somebody in a crowded train. And the answer is it's massive. How much cortisol is released by somebody into the bloodstream simply by being on a crowded train is massive. Now, cortisol is basically pure glucose and insulin. So it's a massive injection of energy. It comes into the bloodstream very fast. So when you're in that crowded train, because the brain wants an instant response. So within a few milliseconds, you will be getting your dose of cortisol. And if you had to run away, you would be dispersing it. But if you're not running away because you're in the crowded train, it stays in the bloodstream and it just goes around, and it can take several hours for it to dissipate. And then you get on the train to come home. And so you're kind of injecting yourself twice a day for your working life with diabetes, really. Doesn't sound like a very good thing to do. And of course, brain knows it's not a good thing to do, so it doesn't like it. And so it kind of perpetuates that action. But this is the brain adapting to the environment. When it's trying to say, I know you have to go to work, therefore, I'm going to sort of try and calm you down a bit so that you don't do all of the responding that you really want to do in order not to have that situation. I'm going to do my best to calm you down. That is the brain adapting to the environment. And this is one of the things that neurodiverse people find difficult. But I work in the transport sector. Maybe we try and make the train adapt to the brain. And so these are the kinds of questions that I ask in my research work is, so how do I make the train adapt to the brain so that we don't have to have all of that trouble with the cortisol? And that is, of course, the big question of transport design. And how do we design the environment in order to be able to accommodate people with different capabilities? And when I talk about environment, I don't just mean the physical environment, it means everything. It means everything that isn't, well, actually it includes you, inside you, but the exteroceptive environment is the rest of the world, other people, other places, the heat, the temperature outside your body, and of course you have an interoceptive environment inside your body. We don't often think about it in that way, but actually if you have a really bad stomach ache, and you will respond to the world in a different way than if you didn't have a very bad stomach ache. That is your interoceptive environment. talking to the brain responding to it. That's why the brain is such an important part of accessibility. And that interoceptive environment means that that whole sensorial system of telling your brain about what's going on inside your body is massive. You know, we tend to think the brain sits inside our skull. And yes, there's about 86 billion neurons inside our skull, but there's actually 300,000 in our gut, and there's several in your fingers. It's all over your body. And so when we talk about the environment, we mean everything, but we also mean things like education choices, life choices, career choices. These are environments that can impose stress, can impose physical requirements on people that affect how they are going to be able to interact with the world. Those two bits about managing the brain, either the brain adapting to the environment or the environment adapting to the brain, are what we call niche construction. This is how, when the brain is doing that kind of adaptation, you say, oh, I'm in this crowded train, I need to do this. And therefore, I'm going to be able to do that. And that is kind of how the brain starts to put that together. And the question then becomes how it does that. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But when you put all this together, I think we come up with another kind of ecology. When we begin to understand, if we get this right, if we get all of this right, what we end up with is what Murray Bookchin refers to as the ecology of freedom. And I rather like the frame of the ecology of freedom. Why? Because the sense that freedom isn't a thing either, that actually it's about a whole system, ecology in the sense of there being a whole organic living system that is free. When we have accessibility in the way that we should, so that everybody is able to do the things that they wish and need to do, then only then maybe we can actually talk about being in a system, being in a society, being in a world, being in an ecological system where we are free. And that means we have to think about creating it. So, how do we create it? Well, I had a look around. I couldn't do it, so I built a laboratory to do it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my laboratory, because not really because this is what this is about, but it's because I can show you examples of what we're talking about. So my laboratory is called PEARL, Person Environment Activity Research Laboratory, and it kind of is what it says on the tin, as it were. We talk about people doing things in an environment and how do those adaptive environments work? How do the brain, the environment adapt to each other, and how do we do that? And we are very keen that as a laboratory we have a mission. That this mission, we're the only one in the university that actually has a mission that isn't about making more money or writing more papers. Right? What we want to do is make a better world. And I think that's a much better thing to do. And that world needs to be one in which people are thriving. They're doing so together and in a very mutually beneficial way. This goes back to this idea of sociality. How do we thrive together beneficially in a safe, equitable, and healthy way? So that's that's our Monday job. Inside that shed, we have space, and we kind of build worlds, and we have a lighting system. We can simulate light from anywhere on the planet at any time of day. So we can make the difference between 8 o'clock in the morning and 8 o'clock in the evening, anywhere. The lighting system actually maps the vision capability of the human eye. So if we look through, I can't show you a picture of all the lighting because if you were in the space, you would be able to see the wackiest rainbow you ever could imagine. But if you filmed it, your camera can't see that. You would have a whole load of black and white in the middle because it's beyond the capability of the camera. And by varying the intensity of those colors, we can then create the colors of Greece in the early morning, south of France in the early afternoon, whatever you want, Dublin in the evening, and so on. So we can do all of that. And we can make it completely without light at all. And we can make it very bright indeed. And we can put a sun in there, we can do glare, we can do all those kinds of things. We can deal with touch. We build environments in there, they feel like things. We can put smell in there. Depending on who's there, we can make that a very nice smell, or we can make it a very nasty smell. But essentially, smell is one of our very important senses, very poorly understood sense, but it is a sense that is actually really important, life-saving kind of sense. And we can vary all of those things at the same time. So I have a student working, poor thing, I have a student working on how a street, how do you feel about a street when it smells of lavender and you have birds singing? How do you think of that street when you hear the birds singing, but it now smells of diesel? How, and does it matter if the bird is one kind of bird or another kind of bird? And so on. Unpicking the data for that is a very interesting example, and she is due to finish doing that shortly. So she's working very hard. But we can then set up all these things and take them away. So we can fill the place with fog, so that we can reduce the visibility to about 60 centimeters. We can, as I said before, we can take the light away. We can combine the smoke with color. And we can then, because actually all of these things are actually controlled with the benefit of a theatrical control system, we can then put them all together. So we can make an explosion, for example. So you have the sound, you have the smell, you have the smoke, you have the light, all of those sorts of things. And then we can move, because we understand how the brain is receiving information, we can then move the explosion to another part of the laboratory and do it again and see how you react in a different direction and those sorts of things. So we can have a jolly good party. And our main instrument of measurement is a person, because we're trying to understand how the brain interacts with the environment, and therefore where do we find brains? We're usually in people. So we test them with people. And here's an example. This is one of our control participants in an experiment with dementia, people with dementia a few years ago. She is wearing an array of kit, eye tracking glasses. She's got accelerometers on her head. You can't see them in the photograph, but she also has them on her shoulder. We're measuring how her head is moving relative to her shoulders. We're measuring how her feet are moving. And this is all about how a dementia person sees. She's a control participant, so we need to know how somebody who does not yet have a diagnosis of dementia, how do they see things, and so on. I'm not going to talk too much about that experiment, but essentially, in order to do that, we have a lot of kit. What she's not wearing is some of the other kit that we have. For example, we have brain scanners, different varieties of brain scanners. We have measures for skin conductance, so we can measure stress. As I said earlier, we can measure cortisol and hormone secretions and so on. And we can do that in groups. We can do it individually. We obviously do psychological inquiries and all of those sorts of things. And we look at the interactions of how do people interact with each other and how do they interact with things. So all of those kind of things are done. And we have this sort of mixture of observing, watching, interviewing, all those sorts of ways of finding these things out, plus the more, for want of a better word, quantifiable physiological measurements that one might take in order to see what is the body doing and what does the mind think that the body is doing, and how do we actually compare those things. We did an experiment many years ago where people had to climb up and down a number of step heights, different step heights. They had to go up and down 27 step heights. That's 54 height differences they had to go through. And I remember watching somebody doing this, an elderly woman doing this. And I asked her after, so how was that, Neri? How did you find that? And she said, it was absolutely fine. It was really great. And I just thought, actually, you look as if you nearly died. You know, and what was that about? That was about her brain adaptation to the environment was to convince herself that she was absolutely fine. Because if she didn't, she would be kind of admitting that she couldn't do it. And that puts her into a different psychological box. And the brain's response is not to go there. So her natural response is to believe that she felt fine. And that is the kind of piece that we're trying to unpick in this laboratory. This is an example of a part of the ecological world, London Underground. This is a mock-up tube train. We were looking at how people board and alight from the tube train under various conditions or platform gaps between the train and the platform, whether you had doors on the platform edge, and what were the different seating arrangements within the train near the doors, how did that affect all these kinds of things, and what happens when you get into very crush loading situations and all of those sorts of things. That train, that experiment, this was taken, I think, in 2012, 12 years ago. Those trains are now being tested in Germany, and they're due to be delivered later this year to start in service early next year. That's how long it takes the UK to design a train. Wouldn't take that long in China. But what we're looking at is, and this is a very important part of all of this, is to see the world in this ecological way. And if we took those people and saw how they got on and off a train in a very micro kind of environment, like a wooden box with a step or something like that, you would get numbers. You would get an answer of some sort, but it wouldn't be ecologically sound. How they respond, it is important that that train had the shape, the very distinctive shape of a London tube train, because people react differently. And getting that kind of thing right is why we build the laboratory. How do we do that? Well, as you can see, the decor is wonderful. It's black. Why is it black? Because we can take the world away. So we take the periphery away. You're not very good at seeing black things on the side. We set the lighting so that it's above the upper extent of the peripheral visual field, so that you can't see the lights. When you're doing things in there, you're tending to look slightly downwards, so you don't see the actual point lights. What you do see is the light that we have created. The horizontal peripheral field, so the sides of the building, do not have straight lines. And that's because you have a part of the visual cortex that latches onto geometrical patterns and tells you that that's a straight line. And you know that straight lines do not exist in nature. So if you see a straight line, you know you're in an artificial environment. So by taking straight lines away, that gives us the freedom to start playing with the edge of your visual field. And by having, so we have those wrinkly curtains and things like that. And then, because it's all black and you lose your sense of perspective, we can convince you that the building is much bigger than it actually is. So it could be, it's actually this part of it, the space that you're looking at there is about 20 meters wide. The actual building is 40 meters wide, but we can convince you that it's 100 meters or 200 even. And the length is also very important. The length of the building, 100 meters, it's a bit like a football field. And the height is around about 10. We've set the sound level low, so it's very quiet in there, and the reverberation time is very short. So you imagine that building not acoustically treated like this, but that a building of that size you would expect to be pretty echoic. But actually the reverberation time in there is a bit shorter than this. Why? Because you can't take reverberation out of a building. You can put it in, but you can't take it out. So we have an active reverberation system in there. That means that we can create reverberation electronically. We can't do it physically because the building is too big. And if we made physical changes to the building to increase the reverberation, we would have to excite the building by creating such a loud noise you wouldn't be able to have a person in there in order to get the physical space to respond. So we do it electronically, and that means that we've had experiments in there with reverberation times of up to 212 seconds, 3.5 minutes. That makes a talk very long. Okay. And what else have we done? So we built a park in there. that was for experiments with autistic children, because psychiatrists found that autistic children in a situation where they are calmed, if you like, by the green space of a park, and they like playing in the park. But in an urban area, the park is subjected to urban noise. So you have traffic, you have emergency vehicle sirens, you have helicopters, you have all of these kinds of things that happen in places like London. And the psychiatrists understood that the autistic children have a problem with this conflict, but they didn't understand what the problem was or how much of a problem or what drove it and things like that. So we built a park for them in which we could control the sounds. So we could have the children playing in the park, and they had the smell. That tree in there is a real tree. They could play in the park, had a great time playing in the park, and then we could bring a helicopter. And how do they respond to that helicopter? How do they respond to the ambulance siren and all of those kinds of things? And that's been very useful. It's kind of changed their view about how to look at these kind of problems from the psychiatry perspective. This is a supermarket that we built for Oxford University. They had been doing work on autism and environment, and they had found that the most difficult environment, or one of the most difficult environments for autistic people, were supermarkets. Go in a supermarket, very bright, very loud, and lots of very odd things. Like supermarkets like to, in England anyway, like to stack the shelves a lot to show how rich they are with lots of product. For autistic people, that is very difficult because they can't decide which one to choose. That becomes a cognitive load. The light is very bright, so the lighting is very difficult for them. The sound is often very loud, as do one of the big supermarket chains in UK, as do radio. They have their own radio channel, and it's very loud, and they can't cope with that. And also, you tend to have very disassociative smells. So what I mean by that is you might be looking at cheese, but you're smelling chocolate. So that adds a cognitive load. So if your capacity for accommodating additional cognitive load is reduced for whatever reason, that becomes a challenge, just like being on the crowded train that I was talking about earlier. So we could create all of those conditions, and then we could start to work out how to reduce them. So we could change the lighting, we can change the noise, we can move the smell, we can do all of those kinds of things. And then we brought in the supermarket operators to say, here's what your supermarket looks like. And if you do these things to the lighting, here is what it looks like. And an awful lot of those things are almost costless for them. It would really be, changing the light bulb is not a massive issue for a supermarket. Changing the stacking shelves policy might be more difficult. But it meant that they could see it and they could experience it, as well as the autistic people seeing and experiencing and making sure that we had actually represented it properly. I talked about fog. This was an experiment for Transport for London. It's about the visibility or the legibility of the destination blind on a bus. And the destination blind on the bus in London, typically for the last probably 110, 112 years, has been paper. And before that, it was a board with painted things on it. So paper. So the buses have a big long roll of paper with destinations and routes and things printed on them. It gets a bit awkward if you want to change the route, and you only can get so many routes on a roll. So if you need, sometimes they have a big problem because you want to put bus X onto route 3 instead of route 5, then you have to change the destination roller in order to have route 5 on it. Clearly not very good, but Transport for London's very proud of its font, the Johnson font. And so they wanted to know, would digital technology, which is the obvious answer to this problem, would digital technology producing that font, would it be difficult for people to read? Because you are losing the smoothness of the edge of the characters, particularly with curvy characters like 0 or 8 or S, and so on. So we brought the bus in, as you can see. We brought the bus in and we tested various signs on the destination indicator and we had people from different distances trying to read them and to reproduce what they could see, different distances, different angles. And we introduced fog, not because we get that much fog in London these days, but because one of the things we discovered in doing this was that the way that an LED chip disperses light is different from the way that an LCD chip disperses light. And what it means is that the LED chip opens it out at a wider angle. So when you're looking at the edge of a character, you're actually looking through the glow of the light from the middle of the character. And so we wanted to know whether that was helpful or not. It might mask the rough edges from the pixels, or it might make it worse. So we wanted to find that out. So that's why we had the fog. So that kept us all very happy. So what drives all this? Well, it's about science. So I'm going to tell you a story. So the story I'm going to tell you is about a train. So you have this train traveling along, and all these people sitting in the train. They hear the train slow down. Train puts on its brakes. It stops in the station, and as it's doing all of that, the passengers all lean forward. The ones who are facing the direction of travel all lean forward, and you sort of wonder why. Why does that happen? So I talked a little bit earlier about how the brain works out things. So this is a really, really rapid 35-second whiz through the whole of neuroscience. So you create perceptions, and we act on the basis of perceptions, and those perceptions come from two kind of sources. The first source is what we call lived experience. That is everything that you have ever experienced in your life from before you were born. Some people argue it includes genetically right back to the beginning of time, possibly. We don't need to worry too much about that. There's, for example, things like color vision is a very genetic issue. So that you could argue goes before birth, before conception. You could argue some other issues that might go back that far, but it doesn't really matter. You start with a set of beliefs that this is my lived experience, to which you add multisensory information. We talk about vision, hearings, and so on. Actually, we count around 70 senses when we're looking at this issue. Not all of them all of the time. Some become more important depending on what we're looking for. That goes through a kind of blender, if you like, with the lived experience to create the brain's response. Release cortisol. From that, you become aware that you are stressed, and that's your perception. From that perception, you then react. So that's kind of how you do it, and that just goes on all the time. And that process, that blender, is taking that multisensory data, mixing it with the lived experience to create your new perception. That's what we call active inference. And that really is the kind of key. So active inference, as a model, says that people are not just trying to make sense of the sensations that they have. What they do is they create them. You receive information or data from the world. Let's just take, doesn't really matter, we take any sense, hearing, for example. So you receive, what do you actually receive? You receive air pressure waves, variations in air pressure. You have your ears, very, very smart, sense your hearing. Personally, I think hearing sense is actually what I would call the primary sense, more than vision, even more than vision, simply because it tells the vision where to look. But let's not discuss that today. You get all these air pressure waves. So you have a little, quite sophisticated system inside your ear that converts air pressure waves into electrical signals. Your brain eventually receives those electrical signals, and all your brain hears is nothing. Your brain receives electrical signals that have come from the hearing system, just as it receives electrical signals that have come from the vision system, the smell system, your stomach, your heart, your liver, and so on. That is all your brain gets. What you then do is you create the world that you think. So if you imagine saying something like, oh, I've got all this sense of, all this load of data coming in, all these electrical signals coming in. The last time I had that sense of all of these signals coming together like this, it was a bus. And therefore, I think it's a bus. You kind of put up your hypothesis. I believe it is a bus. Therefore, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. And that, because that's continuing all the time, you may decide it isn't a bus after all, or you may swear that it was a bus, whether or not it was a bus. Eyewitnesses are the worst people in a courtroom. Well, not the worst people in the courtroom. They're not very helpful in giving evidence because they're quite often wrong, because that process of creating that sense, that image, that idea of what that thing was, whether it was a blue car or a red car or whatever it is that they're talking about, that was created in their mind, and it could easily have been incorrect, and very often is. But that is what we talk about active inference. So active inference is about creating the world that you believe it to be, and then acting on that so that you then move forward. That's why it's active. So we go back to the story. Now let's put the active inference hat on. So that story was actually, it's a bit of a cheat because it wasn't about a train moving at all. It was about an experiment where we had a train that was sitting down in the laboratory, and it never moved. So those passengers heard the sound of the train reducing its speed, applying the brakes. That got converted into electrical stimuli. The brain says, train's slowing down, you are going to be, the last time I heard the train slowing down, you are going to be subjected to inertial forces. Therefore, to protect you, or to protect me, the brain probably, from the effects of those inertial forces, I'm going to get you to lean forward so that you are ready to absorb them more easily. That is the process that was going on there. And that is an example, if you like, of active inference. And the interesting thing about active inference is it displays a really important difference between living organisms, for example, people, and non-living systems, that they work in very opposite ways. So a non-living system is like the ink on the lead. So I've got an image here, Kevin, of ink being poured into water. So it's spreading through all the waters, it's dispersing. And another image of a fish who's just swum out of the image, but the image of the fish in a bowl on the right of this, and the difference between the ink and the fish is that the ink is just going to carry on dissipating itself in that water until entropy is maximized, and the water is a kind of single inky color. That's the maximizing entropy of the second law of thermodynamics, that systems work. This bench, the seats, the building are all obeying the second law of thermodynamics, and they are maximizing entropy. The fish is not maximizing entropy. The fish is minimizing entropy. Why? Because living organisms remain being living organisms until they die. And while they are a living organism, they minimize entropy. So that fish remained a fish. So it means that the fish is looking to be in water in order to minimize its entropy or minimize its surprise, if we talk about the sort of Shannon idea of entropy, to minimize the surprise of finding itself in air. It wouldn't like that very much. So it seeks water in order to minimize its entropy. And that is what people do. So when we come out into the street, let's look at an example. This is an example of a floating island bus stop in London. It's not as beautiful as the floating island bus stop I was looking at this afternoon in Dublin, but it's a floating island bus stop, and visually impaired people find these very, very threatening for all sorts of reasons. And the interesting thing, we've just been doing some experiments on this, and one of the things that comes out of the experiments is that the visually impaired people The principal thing is they see this, or they experience this, they feel this bus stop, and they are scared. Why? Because the lived experience is that it's a scary environment. They've been surprised, they've been shocked, etc., by the sudden appearance of a bicycle that they never realized was there, and all that sort of stuff. So that is their lived experience that they receive. Minimizing their entropy, they want to avoid that. So many of them in the focus group part of the experiment, the focus group work, many of them said, I don't go on a bus if it's going to use one of those bus stops. And for some people, that means not going on a bus at all, not leaving home at all, getting into the issues around isolation, depression, and so on. This is a really big, serious thing. That's the kind of effect that minimizing entropy has on the world, on people in the world. So we needed to think about how we're going to create a solution. So we built a bus stop in the laboratory, and we brought a bus in, and we tested this with cyclists. So we were not testing the cyclists. So we used cyclists because we wanted the cyclists to be going at set speeds and to behave, and because they were not a variable in this. They were a parameter, not a variable, really. So we got the cyclists to do what we told them to do, which was an interesting challenge. And then we asked people to be able to navigate around the bus stop in ways that we could then start to unpick what was actually happening in the bus stop so that we could see what was going on. We then measured their neurophysiological responses to things like when did they think they could hear or could they detect a bicycle? When did they feel safe? When did they not feel safe? How do they actually manage to navigate around the island and so on? And put all that together, what comes out of that is the sense that actually the real problem with these floating island bus stops in many ways is not the physicality of the floating island bus stop. It's what that physicality causes. And the physicality causes other reactions, for example, in cyclists, but also other people, that create that sense of fear. That means that they are stressed, they're not in the state that they ought to be in. And it's not just the fact that a cyclist is going fast. That is a kind of, that problem happened before. Turning up on the bus stop simply says, the brain says, I sense I am on a floating island bus stop. The last time I was on a floating island bus stop, I thought I nearly died. That's what it's responding to. And that is where the problem lies. So if we want to create a solution, we have to get a solution that's not going to fix the bus stop. We've got to fix the fear. And that is kind of where we're at. We also tested another bus stop in London, which is even worse. And so we're just in the process of writing that up, and that's going to get released in a few weeks' time, so that we can start to see. But what I'm very keen on, and I think this is what we can do here, is to put the problem in the right place. Let's solve the right problem, not just the superficial problem. And I think being able to unpick something as complex as this in a scientific kind of way is a good way of doing it. Another one, so another sense you have is a sense of heat. How comfortable do I feel? Transport for London had an issue. We are going a bit late. Transport for London had an issue that was around electric buses. They have a policy, zero emission buses. That means you cannot put a diesel motor on the back to heat it, which is what the usual answer to electric buses is. So it had all the energy for the HVAC system had to come out of the battery. And as a result, you can't drive the bus so far. And the effect of that for Transport for London was to almost double the fleet. So they wanted an answer to that. So I said, well, why are you talking about temperature? Who knows whether the bus is your regulation temperature or not? What I know is I feel cold or I feel hot. And so we talked about how do we actually look at changing the heating system to deliver the sensation to the people so that they would feel comfortable, not necessarily that they knew what the temperature was. And what we managed to do is reduce the temperature by 10 degrees by getting the heat in the right place where people would feel either warm in the winter or cool in the summer. That upset all of the bus manufacturers, and I had a very hairy meeting in Belfast, amongst other places, but, where they told me that they've been designing buses for 40 years, and they knew how to design buses and didn't want some academic coming and telling them they had to do something different. But fortunately, Transport for London buys more buses than anybody else in the UK, and so they were able to apply their muscle. So now the specification for buses now includes those design changes. So all new buses coming in to London from a few months' time will be according to that. So the measure is the thermal comfort of the passengers rather than some regulation of. So it's quite a significant philosophical change. And I want to just very quickly talk about the e-scooters. We were asked to make a sound for e-scooters to reduce people's fear and surprise of e-scooters. So how do we do that? Well, we made a sound. And sound is based on the way that the human hearing works. So it's designed to respond to your brain, or sorry, to your brain to respond to the sound. And what we did was we created a sound that was kind of like the sound that you would have heard if you were in the savannah 15,000 years ago and you heard a snapping twig, and you knew you had to do something. So we created a sound a bit like that. And we tested it on the picture on the left. We used your ability to locate the sound as a kind of proxy for how well the sound was being detected by you. And then the participants chose the ones that worked best. And the 14 that worked best out of the 150, when we then simulated them moving. So they had to tell us when they could hear the sound moving, which direction and how fast it was going, things like that. And then they chose 5 sounds that performed best there. And they went into the third picture where we put those sounds onto a scooter and tested them actually physically moving through an ambisonic 4-dimensional sound field of a busy junction in London. And what we were looking for was the sound that decreased the feeling of surprise. So going back to that model, you've got all your lived experience, you've got your sensory, you're hearing this sound. How do I make sure that my response is not one of big time stress? And what we ended up with is on these graphs. So this is a trace of EEG of the visual cortex. So this is the part of the brain that the eye is concerned with. And you might not be able to see, but there's a vertical line on the left there where, which is the moment in which the scooter appeared for the first time in the peripheral visual field of the person or the participant. And 372 milliseconds later, you have a spike in the visual cortex, big firing of neurons in the visual cortex. And that was when there was no sound on the scooter. So that is a kind of measure of surprise. Now, 372 milliseconds is important because it takes about 500 milliseconds for you to become consciously aware of a stimulus. So that spike was the brain responding to the sound before the person was actually aware of the scooter. The lower graph looks a bit similar, and you'll see the same spike, almost in the same place. Actually, it's a little bit earlier. It's about 352 milliseconds, but it's much, much smaller. That's the key point. That's when the scooter had a sound. So what you're looking at there is the sound of the scooter going into the brain responding to that by saying the visual cortex is going to expect something. The last time I had these stimuli, it expected this thing, and therefore it's not a surprise. So we could reduce that. And we also got the participants to register their conscious surprise level as a result of the scooter. And in the first case, in the non-sound case, we asked them to score between 1 and 5, very, very simple kind of thing. And their average score over all the participants was about 4.8. And the bottom one, where we had the sound on the scooter, it came down to about 1.6 or 1.7, something like that. So we could actually reduce the surprise. So that sound is now running about on scooters in London, hopefully. So what are we actually trying to do here? If we want to make the world accessible, we need to make sure that everybody's prior perception, so that first starting point, includes experiences that lead them to think they can achieve what they want to achieve. And it's about that we're talking about with accessibility. And as designers, it then becomes, how do we make the world match to make that a reality? And I think it's not, for me, accessibility isn't just about putting a drop curb in or putting braille notice or something like that. It's actually about enabling the body's own processes, that niche construction in the brain of how the brain adapts to the environment and how we can make the environment adapt to the brain so that the brain can adapt to the environment more easily. That is what we're actually talking about. And that's what I'm going to say. Thank you very much.